I was lacing up my shoes when my phone buzzed. I almost ignored it. Saturday afternoons were sacred to me. A slow cup of coffee, maybe a walk around the block if my knee wasn't acting up. My son had invited me over for lunch, and I was actually looking forward to it. He'd said his wife was making pot roast, my late wife Eleanor's recipe, the one she'd passed along years ago. The fact that they still made it meant something to me. Then I read the text. "Harold, don't go over there today. Call me first. This is urgent." It was from my accountant, Raymond Chu. I'd known the man for 11 years. Through my retirement, through Eleanor's passing, through every financial decision I'd made since I sold the hardware store in 2019. Raymond was not a dramatic person. He didn't use the word urgent lightly. My hand was still holding my shoe. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the same bed Eleanor and I had shared for 31 years, and I stared at that message for a long moment. Something cold moved through my chest. I couldn't explain it then. I just knew. The way you know when a storm is coming before the sky changes, that whatever Raymond wanted to tell me was going to change something permanently. I called him back. He picked up before it finished the first ring. "Let me back up, because none of this will make sense unless you understand what the last 2 years looked like for me. Eleanor died in March of 2022. Pancreatic cancer. We had 8 weeks from diagnosis to funeral, and I spent most of those 8 weeks just trying to keep breathing. We'd been married 34 years. She was the one who remembered birthdays and kept the household running, and always knew when I was upset, even when I insisted I was fine. When she was gone, the house didn't feel like a house anymore. It felt like a structure, 4 walls and a roof over a man who no longer knew what to do with his evenings. My son, I'll call him by his name, Connor, stepped in immediately. He and his wife Brenda came over constantly those first few months, bringing food, helping me sort through Eleanor's things, sitting with me when the silence got too loud. Connor was 41 at the time, a project manager at a construction firm outside of Columbus, Ohio. Solid job, nice house in Westerville. 2 kids in middle school. I was grateful. I told him so regularly. What I didn't notice, what I couldn't see because I was grieving and trusting and frankly just tired, was that Connor had also started asking questions. Not in a pushy way, in a concerned way. The kind that sounds like love. "Dad, have you thought about what happens to the house if something happens to you? Dad, do you have a financial advisor you trust, or is it all just sitting in accounts? Dad, I read that a lot of older folks get taken advantage of. You should really think about having someone manage things." At the time, I thought he was being responsible, thoughtful even. I told Raymond about the conversations, and Raymond said I should think carefully before giving anyone, legal authority over my finances. I appreciated the advice. I thanked him, and then I went home and mostly forgot about it, because my knee was bad that week, and my neighbor's dog had gotten into my garden again, and there were 100 small things demanding my attention. I had a house paid off in Dublin, Ohio, a modest investment portfolio. Nothing extravagant, but enough to live comfortably into old age. A savings account with enough liquidity that I didn't have to panic about anything, and a will that left everything to Connor, because Connor was my son, and I had trusted him the way you trust someone you raised from a newborn. That was the version of my life I believed in until Raymond called me back that Saturday afternoon. "Harold," he said. His voice was careful in a way that made my stomach drop. "I need you to come to my office Monday morning. But more importantly, I need you to not go to Connor's today." I asked him why. There was a pause. Raymond is not a man who pauses. He talks fast and thinks faster, and usually has the answer before you finish the question. "Because I received some documents this week," he said slowly, "and I think you need to see them before you sit down at that table and eat pot roast and act like everything is normal." I asked him what kind of documents. "A power of attorney application," he said, "filed with a notary in Franklin County 3 weeks ago." Connor and Brenda are claiming you have early-stage cognitive decline and are requesting limited authority over your financial accounts. I didn't say anything for a moment. Harold? I'm here, I said. There's more, he said. I think you should sit down. I was already sitting, I just didn't tell him that. Here's what Raymond explained to me over the next 40 minutes. Brenda, my daughter-in-law, the woman who had been making Eleanor's pot roast recipe in her kitchen, had been quietly building a case. She'd been documenting things. Small things. A phone call where I couldn't remember a neighbor's last name. A time I showed up to Connor's house on the wrong Sunday, a prescription that I'd accidentally refilled twice in 1 month. None of those things were signs of cognitive decline. I knew that. Raymond knew that. But taken together, written up in a careful document with official-sounding language, they were designed to look like a pattern. The POA they'd filed was described as Limited Financial Management Authority. But Raymond had had his attorney look at the language, and she said the scope was broad enough that once approved, Connor and Brenda would have effective control over my investment accounts and the right to act as co-signers on any real estate transactions, including a sale. The house. They wanted the house. Dublin real estate had gone up significantly. The house Eleanor and I bought in 1991 for $180,000 was now worth somewhere between $510,000 and $540,000, depending on the week. I knew this because Raymond had mentioned it once in passing. I hadn't thought much about it at the time. It was just the house. It was where Eleanor had grown her tomatoes, and where I'd built the deck, and where my grandchildren had spent their summers. To Brenda, apparently, it was an asset. How did you even get these documents? I asked Raymond. The notary used a service we both have access to through the county, he said. I happened to see the filing come through on a routine review. If I hadn't been checking that particular account, Harold, you might not have found out until the application was approved. I sat with that for a moment. The thing about betrayal, real betrayal, the kind that comes from inside your own family, is that it doesn't feel like a punch. It feels like the floor disappearing, like you've been standing on something solid your whole life, and suddenly you look down and realize there was nothing there. I thought about every Sunday dinner, every Father's Day, every time Connor had put his hand on my shoulder at Eleanor's funeral and said, "I've got you, Dad." Every single one of those moments now looked different in the light of what Raymond had just told me. Don't let them know you know, Raymond said. Text Connor and tell him your knee is bad. Skip today. Come see me Monday. We're going to handle this properly. I did what he said. I texted Connor that my knee was flaring up and I'd have to take a rain check on lunch. He sent back a string of emojis and told me to rest up. Said Brenda would save me some leftovers. I put my phone down. I sat in Eleanor's chair, the one by the front window, the one I still hadn't been able to get rid of, and I watched the afternoon light move across the living room floor. I thought about my grandson, Tyler, Connor and Brenda's older boy, 14 years old, quieter than most kids his age. He'd been coming over on weekends lately, ostensibly to help me with yard work. But really, I think he just liked the quiet. He liked sitting at the kitchen table while I made coffee and not having anyone ask him about his grades or his friends or what he wanted to do with his life. We'd watch old baseball games together. He'd eat most of whatever I put in front of him. I thought about Tyler, and I thought about that afternoon 2 weeks earlier when he'd come over and seemed distracted. I'd asked him if everything was okay. He'd shrugged the way teenagers shrug. But then, just as he was leaving, he'd turned back at the door. "Grandpa," he'd said, "I love you." He'd never said it quite like that before. Deliberate, like he was trying to make sure I heard it. At the time, I'd thought he was just going through something adolescent and emotional. Kids that age felt things intensely. I hadn't pushed. Now I wondered if he'd been trying to tell me something. Monday morning came, and I drove to Raymond's office in my truck, the one I'd had for 6 years and had no intention of replacing. His office was on High Street, 2nd floor, above a dry cleaner that had been there since the 90s. I'd been climbing those stairs for over a decade. His assistant, a no-nonsense woman named Patrice, waved me straight back. Raymond had printed everything out and laid it on the conference table like evidence, which, I suppose, is exactly what it was. The POA filing, supporting documentation that Connor and Brenda had submitted, a written statement from a neighbor who said she'd seen me looking confused near my mailbox one morning. I knew exactly which morning that was. I'd locked myself out and was trying to remember if I'd left a spare key at the neighbor's 2 doors down. I wasn't confused. I was problem-solving. Raymond also had someone else in the room, a woman named Sandra Okafor. She was an elder law attorney, calm and precise, with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose and a yellow legal pad in front of her. She walked me through the full picture. What Connor and Brenda had filed was not yet approved. The process for this kind of POA in Ohio required either my signed consent, which they clearly weren't going to get, or a court proceeding where a judge would review evidence of cognitive decline. They'd chosen the latter track. They were planning to request a hearing, which means, Sandra said, they will need to make a public case that your father, your parent, is not capable of managing his own affairs. I let that settle. What do I need to do? I asked. First, she said, we document your capacity thoroughly and immediately. A full cognitive evaluation from your physician. Financial records showing consistent, rational decision-making. Any communication that contradicts their narrative. She paused. And if there's anyone who can speak to your normal day-to-day functioning, neighbors, friends, community members, that will matter. I thought of Tyler again. I may have a witness I wasn't expecting, I said. Tyler had been texting me more than usual that week, nothing dramatic. Just checking in, asking if I needed anything from the store, sending me links to baseball scores. But on Wednesday evening he called. Grandpa, can I come over? He was at my door 20 minutes later, still in his school clothes, backpack over one shoulder. He sat down at the kitchen table and I made him a sandwich without asking, because I could see he hadn't eaten. He ate half of it before he looked up at me. Grandpa, he said, I heard them talking. I sat down across from him. I kept my voice steady. What did you hear? He'd been home from school the previous Thursday, a half day, and his parents hadn't known he was in the house. He'd come in through the back door and gone straight upstairs. And through the floor vent in his bedroom, he'd heard his parents on the phone with someone in the kitchen below. He didn't get all of it, but he got enough. He heard his mother say the evaluation is next month. He heard his father say once we have authority over the accounts, we move fast. He heard his mother say the house is the priority. Tyler had sat in his bedroom for 2 hours afterward without moving. Then he'd come to see me that Saturday. The Saturday before I got Raymond's call, it turned out, and said, I love you at the door the way he had, because he was 14 years old and he'd just found out his parents were planning something against his grandfather, and he didn't know what to do with that. I didn't know how to tell you, he said. His voice cracked slightly. I didn't know if you'd believe me. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. I believe you, I said. Are they going to take your house? No, I said, and sitting there at my kitchen table with my grandson's worried face across from me, something clarified in my chest, a kind of cold, quiet certainty. They are not going to take anything. I asked Tyler if he'd be willing to write down exactly what he'd heard, to the best of his memory. He said yes without hesitating. I called Sandra Okafor that evening and told her what Tyler had shared. She was quiet for a moment. Harold, she said, that child may have just saved your financial future. The next 3 weeks moved in a way that felt both very slow and very fast. I had a full cognitive evaluation with Dr. Elaine Morris, my physician of 14 years. She was thorough and professional, and when she was done, she looked at me over her own reading glasses and said, Harold, you are as sharp as you've ever been. Better than most men, 20 years younger than you. Her written assessment was clear and unambiguous. Sandra documented my financial history going back 5 years. Consistent investment decisions. Regular, appropriate withdrawals. No patterns of confusion or error. Raymond submitted his own professional statement testifying to my mental clarity over the decade plus he'd known me. 3 neighbors wrote letters. My pastor wrote a letter. My brother-in-law in Pittsburgh, Eleanor's brother, who'd known me since 1984, called Sandra directly and spoke with her for 45 minutes. Tyler wrote out what he'd heard. His statement was handwritten in his careful teenage script, and it was 3 pages long. He included the date, the approximate time, and specific phrases he remembered. Sandra said it was one of the more precise witness statements she'd received from someone his age. Connor and Brenda didn't know any of this was happening. I kept showing up to Sunday dinners. I ate the food and watched the football games and bounced my younger grandson on my knee and acted like a man who had no idea what was coming. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done. There was one Sunday, early December, the week before the hearing, when Brenda put her hand on my arm in the kitchen and said, "We just want to make sure you're taken care of, Harold. That's all any of this is." And she looked at me with such practiced sincerity that for half a second I almost doubted myself. Almost wondered if I was reading it wrong, if maybe they really did just care. Then I remembered the phrase Tyler had heard through the floor vent. "The house is the priority." I smiled at Brenda and said I appreciated her concern. The hearing was held on a Tuesday morning in Franklin County. Connor and Brenda had hired an attorney, a younger man who seemed confident when he walked in and considerably less so by the time Sandra was finished. The cognitive evaluation demolished their narrative in a single document. Dr. Morris was present and testified briefly. Her assessment was not something anyone in that room could argue with. Raymond testified to 11 years of clear, consistent financial management. And Tyler, my 14-year-old grandson, who had eaten half a sandwich at my kitchen table and written 3 pages in careful script. His statement was entered into the record. The judge read it. She read it twice. The POA application was denied. Connor's attorney asked for a recess. During that recess, Sandra was approached by their attorney, who wanted to know if there was room for a family resolution outside the proceedings. Sandra looked at him pleasantly and said she'd relay the offer to her client. I told her no. There was nothing to resolve. A resolution implies a misunderstanding. This was not a misunderstanding. I went home that Tuesday and made a pot of coffee and sat in Eleanor's chair by the front window. I want to be honest about what that afternoon felt like, because it didn't feel like a victory. Movies make you think that justice feels triumphant, that when the gavel comes down in your favor, you walk out into sunshine and the music swells. It doesn't feel like that. It feels like grief with a different shape. I had won, and what I'd won was the permanent knowledge that my son had looked at me and seen real estate. I sat in Eleanor's chair for a long time. Then I called Sandra. There were 2 things I wanted to do, and I wanted to do them cleanly and completely. The first was to update my will. I had already thought hard about this, and the thinking had not been pleasant, but it had been clear. Connor was removed as primary beneficiary. In his place, I established a trust, the Eleanor Marsh Family Trust, named for my wife, with Tyler as the primary beneficiary, to be accessible in full when he turned 25, with provisions for his education expenses beginning immediately. A portion went to my brother-in-law and to my church's community fund. Connor and Brenda received nothing. I did not do this out of spite. I want to be careful to say that clearly. I did it because a will is an expression of trust, and Connor had shown me precisely how much of my trust he deserved. The second thing I wanted to do was write Connor a letter, not an angry letter, not an accusatory one. I sat at the kitchen table, The same table where Tyler had eaten half a sandwich and told me the truth. And I wrote my son a letter that took me 4 drafts to get right. I told him I knew what he'd tried to do. I told him I wasn't going to pretend otherwise or allow us to continue a relationship built on a lie that large. I told him that I loved him because he was my son and that would not change. And I told him that love and trust were not the same thing, and that he had broken one of them beyond my ability to repair it. I told him the will had been changed and why. I told him I wished him well. I mailed it the next morning. It has been 8 months now. Connor and I have not spoken since the letter. Brenda sent me a text in February that said she hoped I would reconsider my position. I did not respond. The door is not locked. I am not a man who locks doors permanently, but I will not be the one to open it. Tyler comes over on weekends. He's been teaching me how to follow his favorite basketball team, which I am doing under protest, but with genuine amusement. He eats everything I put in front of him. Last month he brought a friend, a quiet kid named Sam, and they sat at my kitchen table and did homework while I watched the game in the other room, and the house felt, briefly, like a house again. I've been back to Raymond's office twice since the hearing. My finances are in order. The trust is established. The investment accounts are protected with updated beneficiary designations. Everything is documented, organized, and clear. A few weeks ago, I was in the backyard deadheading Eleanor's rose bushes, the ones I keep threatening to dig up and never do. And Tyler came out and stood next to me for a while without saying anything. Then he asked if I thought his grandmother would have liked him. I thought about Eleanor, about the way she could read a person in 30 seconds flat, about how she always said that integrity was the only inheritance worth passing down. She would have loved you, I told him, specifically because of what you did. He thought about that for a moment. Then he picked up the clippers and helped me finish the row. I want to say something to anyone who might be watching this, or reading this, or sitting somewhere in a house that suddenly feels like just a structure. The people who raised you, who dressed your cuts and drove you to practices and showed up without being asked. They are not estates. They are not portfolios. They are not assets waiting to be managed. And if there is a Tyler in your life, a quiet kid who heard something through a vent and wrote 3 careful pages and told the truth even when it cost him something, hold on to that. Some people are born knowing that love is not the same thing as entitlement. My name is Harold Marsh. I am 68 years old. I live in the house where I raised my son and grew old with my wife, and will likely die surrounded by rose bushes I keep threatening to remove. And it is still mine. I've had 8 months to sit with all of this, and the thing I keep coming back to isn't the hearing or the documents or even Brenda's hand on my arm saying we just want you to be taken care of. What I keep coming back to is a 14-year-old boy sitting at my kitchen table eating half a sandwich, trying to find the words to tell his grandfather that the people who raised him were not who his grandfather believed them to be. That took courage. I'm not sure I had at his age. I'm not sure I had it at 50. There's something I've come to understand about the way choices accumulate. Connor didn't become someone who would file fraudulent paperwork against his own father overnight. That kind of thing builds slowly, one small rationalization at a time. First, you tell yourself your parent is getting older and needs managing. Then you tell yourself you know better. Then you start calling love protection and greed responsibility, and before long you've convinced yourself that taking is the same thing as caring. The mind is remarkably good at building a story that lets you sleep at night, no matter what you did during the day. But here's what I've learned. The story you tell yourself and the truth are not always the same document. And eventually, reality files its own paperwork. Raymond had known me for 11 years. He knew what careful, consistent decision-making looked like. He knew what a man with his faculties intact looked like. And because he paid attention, because he was doing his job with genuine diligence, He caught something that might otherwise have slipped through until it was too late. Intelligence isn't just raw ability, it's the discipline to keep showing up, keep reading the fine print, keep asking questions even when everything looks routine. Raymond's diligence gave me time. Time is the one resource you cannot recover once it's gone. And Tyler, that boy had every reason to stay quiet. He loved his parents. He still does. I know that. Choosing to tell me what he heard didn't mean he stopped loving them. It meant he understood, at 14, that love and honesty are not opposites. That you can care deeply about people and still refuse to be complicit in what they're doing wrong. That's not a lesson most adults have fully learned. He had it already, somewhere in his bones. What I want to say to anyone who finds themselves in a house that started to feel like it belongs to someone else, whether that's literally or in some other way, is this: clarity is not cruelty. Knowing the truth and acting on it, even when it costs you something. Even when it means rewriting a will and mailing a letter and sitting with the grief of what your family turned out to be, that is not hardness. That is the hard work of living with integrity intact. I changed the will because I had to be honest about what Connor had shown me about himself. Not out of anger, out of accuracy. And I put Tyler's name in it because he had shown me something too. Some people spend their whole lives proving they can be trusted. Tyler proved it at 14, in 300 pages, on a Tuesday afternoon, when it would have been so much easier to say nothing. The house is still mine. The rose bushes Eleanor planted are still out back. And on weekends, there's a quiet kid at my kitchen table who eats everything I put in front of him. That's enough. That is genuinely, completely enough.